off this bridge on Wayside Park.
São cenas que fazem parte da memória dos Estados Unidos. Em 1929, a Grande Depressão deixou 13 milhões de americanos desempregados, reduziu a produção industrial do país quase pela metade, provocou a quebra de mais de 5 mil bancos e afetou o equilíbrio econômico mundial. Em 2008, a crise mais recente em Wall Street custou aos americanos cerca de 25% de todo o capital acumulado nas últimas décadas, entre perdas no valor das casas próprias e perdas no sistema bancário. O prejuízo estimado da crise ultrapassou 8 trilhões e 300 bilhões de dólares. Cerca de 3 milhões de pessoas perderam o trabalho, levando o número de desempregados no país a mais de 12 milhões. Para o escritor Thom Hartmann, os Estados Unidos vivem entre crises cíclicas. A cada 6 ou 7 décadas, o país esquece o último desastre e embarca sem freios em uma nova crise provocada por predadores, que não hesitam em colocar a economia em risco para acumular capital e poder. E a crise, para Hartmann, não acabou. O que começou em 2008 resultará para ele em um novo crash dentro de 2 anos.
When talking about a crisis to come, a crash to come, you list several things. Some of them are factors, some of them could be called cyclical signs. So I'd like to go through some of them and to get to the notion of what could be, in your definition, the next crash.
Sure.
One of them is cash hoarding. You talk about trillions of dollars being hoarded all over the world.
Yes.
And you talk about a derivatives market that is, in your estimation, actually not in your estimation, but you cite an estimation, 1.2 quadrillion dollars, which is over 20 times all of the GDP of the world.
Right.
What does that mean? Why are banks, hedge funds, governments hoarding money, hoarding cash?
During the last Great Depression in the 1930s, some of the greatest fortunes in the world were made. And they were made because the main phrase of the era was cash is king. That if you had cash, you could buy things for pennies on the dollar. And so I believe we are actually in the midst of this crash, and that we are seeing that right now. There was an interesting story about how the Blackstone Group, the largest private equity firm in the United States, in one day bought several thousand homes in Atlanta. As I recall, $7.5 billion worth of real estate. So what's happening is right now the people who are sitting on the cash are able to buy things for a fraction of what they used to cost. And now, instead of making bets on bets on bets, to get to your derivative question, which had as their underlying value from which they derived, thus the word derivative, mortgages, now they've flipped this. This is no longer legal because of Dodd-Frank. And so they've flipped it, and now they're buying the houses themselves, and instead of monetizing, instead of creating derivatives out of the cash flow from the mortgage payments, they're creating derivatives out of the cash flow from the rental payments.
You remind in your book the reader that there have been some, specifically in the United States, some moments that are very pointed. For instance, the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, Ronald Reagan, and then the deregulation of Wall Street.
Yes.
Those factors are decades old.
Yes.
Are they still playing a role?
Oh, hugely, hugely. Not so much Reagan's 81 reform of Social Security, but more Reagan's 1982 decision to stop enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which has now caused American business to become very, very monolithic. In biological systems, a diverse biological system is very resilient. A jungle, a forest, they can survive a year's drought. They have lots of different species. They're very resilient. But if you have a field that is all one kind of wheat with one single particular type of DNA, it's a monoculture. It's far more fragile. And if you talk to an American who's over 50, they will tell you that before the Reagan presidency, every downtown in America, every shopping center in America was filled with small locally owned businesses. India, for example, just until I believe last year or the year before, had a law that no company or family could own more than 2 retail stores. So there were tens of thousands of small businesses. It was less efficient, but it was very, very resilient. Now, in the United States, virtually every industry, whether it's retailing or media or telecommunications or, you pick it, all of the major industries, agriculture, they're dominated to the extent of more than 70 or 80% by typically fewer than 5 companies, and particularly banking. And this
banking, airlines,
all of it,
steel.
Yeah, you name it. And so what this does is it produces an economy that is very fragile. I would say that's one of the biggest problems that has been left to us from the Reagan era.
But you cite in the book as well the fact that Ronald Reagan, at the end of his administration, and actually Bill Clinton was the one who signed it into law, Wall Street was regulated.
Yeah, that's the second issue. Yeah.
What effect did that have? I mean, we've seen in 2008 one of the effects. You think that this is not over?
Oh, I think we're, as I said, I think we're in the middle of it. I think it's going to get a lot worse. And what's so amazing is how many other countries are emulating, the mistakes that we made. From the George Washington administration to the Franklin Roosevelt administration, for the first 150 years roughly of American history, we never went more than 15 years without a major banking panic nationwide. In 1935, Glass-Steagall was put into effect. The banks were heavily regulated in the United States, and from the Franklin Roosevelt administration until 2006, we never saw another banking crash. And then Phil Gramm came along in 1999, and he said, "Oh, this has worked so well, we don't need it anymore." But the deregulation of the banking industry, in my opinion, was largely driven by Ken Lay and Enron Corporation's desire to get into, first of all, he had these 800 shell companies basically, and the banks were figuring out what he was up to. He wanted to have his own bank. And also he wanted to be able to trade in energy commodities, and then he wanted to be able to get into the derivatives business with energy commodities, and all of that was illegal in the 90s. Wendy Graham was the head of the federal agency, the wife of Phil Gramm. Yeah. She was the head of the federal agency that regulated derivatives, and so she made it legal for Ken Lay to do what he wanted with regard to using energy as a commodity. Mm-hmm. And then she left and went to the board of Enron. And then her husband, several years later, introduced Gramm-Leach-Bliley and the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which deregulated the banks, as you mentioned, and created an opportunity for the banks to go from virtually no derivative market, a very, very small derivative market, to a derivative market that, according to the Bank of International Settlements, was, as you said,
1.2 quadrillion dollars,
yeah,
which is
worldwide, and in the United States it was $800 trillion in 2008, down to around 500 trillion after the crash, but now it's back up to 700 trillion, and the GDP of the whole planet is only $65 trillion. So this is like funny money. I mean, these people they're playing with funny money and skimming. Oh, you do a $1 trillion deal, you take $1 billion commission, you put it in your pocket. So you've got these guys who are becoming billionaires, but this is not how an economy should work.
So we come to the title of your book, The Crash of 2016.
Yeah.
Please describe to me what, in the best possible scenario, would be this crash, and what will it be in the worst possible scenario?
I think the best possible scenario is that, well, I argue in the book that the crash really began in 2006 and we're still in the midst of it. And we're,
Oh, you think we are in the crash of 2016?
Yeah, absolutely. The fundamentals haven't changed. The banks are still deregulated. There's still a multi-hundred-billion-dollar gray market that's unregulated in derivatives. 70% of all the banking activity in the United States right now is being done by computers that are trading 1 million things a minute. It's meaningless. It's not real economic activity. Our economy has gone from a third of our economy being manufacturing to around 10%, 11%. You can't run a government that way. You can't run an economy that way. This is just the United States. We're seeing similar analogs in other countries around the world. So the best case scenario would be like 1929, that what was going on in 2008, 2007, and 2008, we will just simply revert back to that, and it will play itself out. And the good news, of course, is that out of every one of these crashes, whether it was the crash of, which hasn't yet happened, out of the crash of 2008, but out of the crash of 1929, out of the crash of 1897, out of the crash of 1857, out of the crash of 1770, out of every one of these major economic crashes have come major progressive reforms where we have basically tightened the screws and said, okay, we're not going to let the predators do this to us again. The worst case scenario is if the United States or other countries around the world were to flip in this more fascistic direction, more authoritarian direction, and we were to have a world war, because very often crashes are followed by world wars.
About Brazil, what sense do you make of a crisis like this in a country like Brazil?
I would, first of all, I don't represent myself as an authority on Brazil, although I have some familiarity with it. But what I would say is that the crisis we're facing in the United States right now is the consequence of the best intentions of liberals and the best intentions of conservatives being used ultimately by predators. And this will make sense in just a moment, but it's a little bit of a longer explanation. In the 1950s in the United States, Russell Kirk and other conservatives warned that if the American middle class got too large, that people would start demanding things, that social change, that social ferment would happen. So we had all this social ferment going on in the United States, and the conservatives were saying, see, we told you so. The middle class got too big, too fast, and now we've got things going crazy. We've got to dial this back. So the effort to dial it back was basically the Reagan administration. That was Reaganomics, that shift. Let's make the middle class less wealthy, less powerful. And as we make the middle class less wealthy and less powerful, what happened was the bankers, the predators, stepped into that space and said, we know how to skim this off the top. And you're seeing those same kind of tensions going on right now in Brazil between...
Exactly, because our middle class has been greatly enhanced.
Yes. And as a consequence, you're seeing social ferment. You're seeing demands for social change. You're seeing a whole variety of movements across Brazil where, and not just in Brazil, but to be specific, where people are saying, hey, what about me? What about our part of this? And I personally think that's a good thing, but I would say that these rapid motions in either side, either to dial back or to push forward, always produce reaction.
So, interestingly enough, you don't seem to have a problem. You are a progressive. You are a liberal.
Proudly.
You don't seem to have much of a problem with conservatives. You seem to have a problem with predatory logic.
Yes. I think that the conservative worldview is a legitimate one. From Edmund Burke to Barry Goldwater or to George Will, the idea that society should change, but it should change slowly and gradually and incrementally, and test things before you do them. And I understand and respect that. I don't agree with it, but I understand it, and I respect it, and I think it's legitimate. And I also think that the liberal, progressive worldview, that society can lurch forward and make big changes, and some of them are going to be terrible mistakes, and we're just going to have to undo them and do it in a different way, that there's a lot to be said for that. And we can find many examples in the history of both our nations when both have happened. The danger is that the dynamic tension between these two legitimate, well-intentioned political perspectives, when that cracks, the sociopaths step into it, the predators step into it. And when the predators step into it, and particularly when the predators can take control of the political system, as our Supreme Court has now allowed them to do by saying that money is protected under the First Amendment as speech, then you've got a serious problem.
Who are the predators? You talk in your book about the economic royalists.
Yeah.
Who are the predators not only in the United States? What is the definition of the social path, the social predator, as you see it?
Yeah. There's a TV show in America called Hoarding, which I have yet to see. But
people who just...
Yeah, people tell me about it. It's like these people who have, so many newspapers in their house that they can't walk through the living room, or the old lady who has 90 cats, It's like, how much is enough, right? I think that there are this is a mental illness, and it's identifiable. It's a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. And I believe that there are some people who, instead of hoarding cats or newspapers, are hoarding money. And they are equally mentally ill. And then there are also among us the sociopaths, people who don't view other humans as humans. They view other humans as objects, and they think that they're the only human person in the world, and that's maybe 2 or 3 or 4% of the population. And as Businessweek and Forbes both pointed out last year, sociopaths are wildly overrepresented in certain professions, particularly banking and the CEO class. So, because what kind of person could go to sleep at night knowing that they just destroyed 10,000 lives or families? A sociopath can easily do that. So we need to create societal protections against the sociopaths among us. We stop killers, we stop robbers, we stop people who beat other people up, those kinds of criminals. But is somebody who just threw 100,000 people out of their homes by mortgage fraud, is that not equivalent to beating up somebody on the street? Why is that person, because he's worth $1 billion and has a gold-plated jet, why is he treated, like this before Congress, whereas the man who stole somebody's wallet on the street is in prison? We have, at various times in our history, and in the history of every nation, we've always recognized the low-level predators and the low-level sociopaths, the common criminals. Occasionally, we recognize the high-level sociopaths, the high-level criminals.
Historically, we have good
historically,
examples.
and sometimes they've actually been in royal families. Over the French Revolution, I would argue, is a great example of the people rising up and overthrowing a sociopath. And things like the Sherman Antitrust Act in the United States and other ways, the banks are so much more heavily regulated in Brazil, for example, than in the United States, as a way of trying to hold these people back. We need to be conscious of that. And in some ways, my book is a call, more than anything else, to saying, look out for these folks.
Is it human nature that we live, and every 80, 90 years we go through this bulimic absurdity of almost destroying our well-being, and then we start all over again? Is that it?
Well, there are some, I quote Strauss and Howe in the book, their book, The Fourth Turning in Generations, and they're not unique in that observation, that it does seem to be that way. Yeah, it does seem to be that way. In literate societies, in pre-literate societies, where stories were passed down from generation to generation, people tended not to forget. And so if you read, like Peter Farb's Man's Rise to Civilization, a book written back in the 60s about the first contact with 34 different Native American communities in the 1500s, what he found was that these pre-literate societies knew lessons that were thousands of years old because they passed them down and passed them down and passed them down.
But now that we have the written word, we forget.
Yeah, which is a whole other conversation, but it's a fascinating one.
If we learn anything from the crash we're in, what will it be? what solutions are we going to find?
I am hopeful that the biggest solution that we will find is that inequality is a fundamental evil. I mentioned earlier repeating mistakes. In 1920, when Warren Harding ran for president, he ran on two platforms. One, he was going to drop the 91% top tax rate for millionaires and billionaires down to 25%. And number two, he was going to privatize government functions and deregulate. His slogan was less government in business, more business in government. He did both those things in 1921 when he became president, and it led right to the crash of '29. We've seen over the last 30 years essentially the same thing, not done quite as quickly or as aggressively, but essentially the same thing. And we're experiencing the same consequence. The stabilizer, the great stabilizer against these huge disparities of wealth, income inequality, historically has been taxes, has been progressive income taxes and progressive, in some cases, even wealth taxes. And I'm very hopeful that that's something that comes out of this. When that top tax rate is above 50%, then typically the CEO class makes about 30 times what their workers make, and the economy is stable. When it drops below 50, the very wealthy have a lot of hot money. You know, it was not dear, it was not hard to get. It's just a lot of hot money. And so they gamble it. They start throwing, oh, let's do derivatives, let's do mortgages, let's do this, let's do that. And that then leads to bubbles, which leads to crashes. So I think that this great stabilizing effect, combined with a knowledge of how inequality destroys social trust. As inequality goes up, crime goes up, teenage pregnancies go up, sexually transmitted diseases go up, social trust goes down, political discourse coarsens, you're more likely to see the rise of radical political movements, you're more likely to see less stable economies. All of these things are the consequence of inequality. And I think that, and I'm not calling for a Marxist world by any stretch of the imagination, but I think by just moderating some of the inequality that we see in the world, we can produce a much, much better world.
Thank you very much.
Very thoughtful questions.
Thank you.
It's been an honor meeting you.
Thank you. Honor mine.
Thank you.